Clause 15. Who changed it? Victor Hale's voice cut through the 40th floor glass conference room like a blade through silk. Every executive in the room lowered their gaze. On the crystal table, a $750 million international contract waited for signatures. Beside it stood Clara Nguyen, 14 years old, the cleaning woman's daughter, holding a misprinted page. White fluorescent light reflected off her young but determined face. "Sir," she said quietly, "the clause is wrong." Laughter rippled through the room. A child discussing contracts. Lon, her mother, froze. "Clara, put that down, sweetheart." But the girl pointed at the number. 0.5% had become 5%. Every laugh died instantly. Victor snatched the paper, read it, then slowly raised his head. Who allowed this child to touch these documents? The question dropped into the silence like a needle piercing skin. The central question. When truth comes from the lowest person in the room, will those at the top dare to listen? The basement staff quarters of Weston Dynamics were a place few ever visited. No windows, no color, just the hum of washing machines, the sting of bleach, and the sickly green glow of fluorescent tubes overhead. At the end of the furthest corridor, Lon, a longtime cleaning staff member, and her daughter Clara, lived in a room half the size of a storage closet. On the desk sat an old notebook, its cover worn smooth, filled with neat masculine handwriting. Numbers are truth. Never let anyone change them for money. The notebook had belonged to Clara's grandfather once, an accountant, the man who taught her to read financial reports like stories. Clara learned quickly. Though only 14, she could spot the difference between 0.5% and 5% by instinct alone. Every night she studied under flickering light, reading old documents her mother salvaged from office trash bins. Lon loved her daughter, but lived in fear. "Baby, don't read their papers. That world isn't meant for people like us." Clara only smiled. "But I want to understand how they talk about justice, Mom." One day, Lon was assigned to clean the main conference room where Victor prepared to sign a contract with European partners. Clara asked to come along, promising to sit quietly. She silently arranged cups, wiped the glass table, caught fragments of conversation. Clause, profit margin, distribution. When everyone left, she glanced down at the table. A printout had fallen out. The line reading, "Profit distribution 5%, made her pause. She found another copy to cross-check. All of them read 0.5%. 1 decimal point. An entirely different world. She folded it carefully, tucked it inside her grandfather's notebook. The building gleamed through the windows like a cathedral of light and ambition. Around her, the mechanical symphony of industry hummed its indifferent song copiers, churning elevators, chiming voices echoing through marble hallways, about markets and margins and empires built on contracts. But down here in this fluorescent tomb, Clara sat with nothing but a worn notebook and a truth no one had asked her to find. She traced her finger over her grandfather's words again. Numbers are truth. He had lost his job for refusing to falsify a report. He died poor. He died honest. Her mother said he died foolish. But Clara remembered his eyes, how they never looked away even when the world demanded it. She looked at the misprinted page again. 5% instead of 0.5. Such a small error. Such an enormous lie. Tomorrow important people would gather in that glass room. They would shake hands, smile for cameras, sign documents that would move millions across continents. And none of them would notice. Because none of them were looking. Clara closed the notebook gently, as if it were sacred text. She thought of her mother's tired hands. The way Lon scrubbed floors until her knees ached. The way she smiled at executives who never learned her name. The way she whispered every night, "Stay small, stay safe, stay invisible." But her grandfather had taught her something different. He taught her that truth doesn't need permission. It only needs a witness. Clara looked up at the tower of glass and steel rising above her, its windows blazing with the light of 1,000 ambitions. "One day," she whispered to the empty room, "they'll have to hear me speak." The fluorescent bulb above her flickered once, then held steady, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Monday morning arrived with the weight of ceremony. The building blazed with light as delegations from France, Japan, Italy, and Germany filled the executive lobby. Victor Hale, CEO, emerged from the private elevator black suit, tailored to perfection, voice commanding, presence cold with confidence. Lon wheeled the tea cart into the conference room, Clara following behind, positioning herself in the farthest corner. The projector displayed the contract in dual languages. But when the French version appeared, the translation system glitched, showing two different numbers on opposite screens. A translation specialist waved it off. Just a display error. Nothing to worry about. Victor nodded, gesturing to proceed with signing. But Clara's voice cut through softly. "Excuse me, sir. It's not a display error." Every head turned. A child standing in the middle of the glass cathedral. Lan's face went pale, nearly dropping the tea tray. "Clause 15, Clara said, pointing at the screen. 0.5 became 5. A moment of silence, then mocking laughter rippled through the room. "A child reads contracts now." Victor glanced at the screen more carefully. His expression slowly changed. "Who printed this?" His assistant trembled. "Legal department, sir." The French delegate leaned forward, studying the document, then nodded gravely. "The child is correct. Mistranslation. Very dangerous." Every eye fixed on Victor. He inhaled deeply. "Thank you, Miss Clara," she answered, voice small but certain. Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at his legal team, then at the international partners watching him with newly suspicious eyes. The German representative removed his glasses. "If this error exists here, where else might it exist?" The Italian delegate closed her folder. "Perhaps we should postpone until a full audit." "That won't be necessary." Victor interrupted, his voice steady, despite the earthquake beneath his feet. "We'll verify every clause. Now." He turned to his chief counsel. "Richard, explain how this happened." Richard Carter stood, smoothing his tie. "A simple system error, Victor. The contract management software was updated 3 days ago," Clara said quietly. The room fell silent again. Victor's eyes narrowed. "How do you know that?" Clara hesitated, glancing at her mother, whose expression pleaded for silence. But truth doesn't wait for permission. I saw the backup files in the recycling bin when Mom was cleaning," Clara said. "The original all said 0.5%. Someone changed them manually after the system update." Richard's face flushed red. "This is absurd. We're taking corporate counsel from a child who reads our trash." The Japanese delegate spoke for the first time, his English precise. "In my culture we have a saying, truth has no age. Only clarity." He looked directly at Victor. "I suggest you listen." Victor stood motionless, a statue carved from ice and calculation. Decades of business had taught him to read rooms. Red people read the invisible currents of power and deception. And right now, every instinct screamed that something was wrong. He pressed the intercom. "Security. I need Richard Carter's workstation access logs for the past week. Now." "Victor, this is humiliating," Richard began. "Then you have nothing to hide," Victor replied, his voice dangerously quiet. The room waited in suffocating silence. 2 minutes later, the head of IT security entered, tablet in hand, face grim. "Sir, there were manual edits to the contract files. 3 days ago, 11:23 p.m. Victor took the tablet, studied it. His expression turned to stone. "User ID rcarterauden.com. Richard's face drained of color. "I was working late. You changed 0.5 to 5 in 17 separate clauses," Victor said, his voice cutting like wire. "That's not an error. That's deliberate fraud." The French delegate stood abruptly. 17 clauses, mon Dieu." Richard's hands shook. "You don't understand, there were pressures complications in the profit-sharing model." "Get him out," Victor said coldly. "Security, escort Mr. Carter to his office, collect his devices, and contact our attorneys." As 2 security officers approached, Richard pointed at Clara with trembling finger. "A cleaning woman's daughter. You're trusting her over me. Over 15 years of service." Victor walked slowly toward Clara, until he stood directly before her. She didn't flinch. "I'm trusting someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking," Victor said. "Which is more than I can say for you." As Richard was led away, still protesting, still denying, Victor remained standing before Clara. The executives watched. The international partners watched. Lan watched tears streaming silently down her face. And Clara watched Victor's eyes, seeing something shift behind them, something she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, not anger, something older, something deeper. Recognition. The recognition of someone who'd forgotten what integrity looked like until it stood before him in the form of a 14-year-old girl holding a truth no one else dared to speak. That evening, Lan was summoned to Human Resources. The woman behind the desk didn't meet her eyes. "You violated restricted area protocols. Your daughter accessed confidential materials. 7-day suspension without pay." Lan wept. Clara remained silent. The apartment that night felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in with the weight of consequence. "I told you," Lan whispered, her voice breaking. "I told you to stay invisible. Now what do we do? 7 days without pay, Clara. 7 days. Mom, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't feed us. Sorry doesn't keep the lights on." Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at her hands. But something gnawed at her, something incomplete, a story with missing pages. Richard Carter's panic had seemed too extreme for a simple error. His fear too visceral. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, something she'd found on the translation desk, forgotten in the chaos. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Follow the numbers. They always tell the full story." She plugged it into the ancient laptop her mother had bought second-hand 3 years ago. The drive opened contract revision logs, metadata timestamps. Her heart began to pound. 11:23 p.m. User r.carterauden.com. Modified 0.5 to 5 across multiple clauses. But there was more. She clicked deeper into the folders. Email threads. Encrypted files with weak passwords. Carter 2024. Pathetically simple. She opened them one by one, her hands trembling. Bank transfer confirmations. Offshore accounts. Communication threads with a company called Meridian Holdings LLC. And then she found a wire transfer receipt for $1.2 million dated the same night as the contract modifications. Memo line. Consulting services, profit redistribution advisory. Clara printed everything, her printer grinding loudly in the silent apartment. She highlighted the key sections in red, just like her grandfather used to do, then tucked them carefully into his old notebook. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a mistake. This was systematic fraud. Richard Carter hadn't just made an error, he'd been paid to sabotage his own company's contract, inflating the profit share to bleed Weston Dynamics of hundreds of millions over the contract's lifetime. She sat back, her mind racing through the implications. If Victor had signed that contract, the company would have been legally bound to pay 5% instead of 0.5% on a $750 million deal. The overpayment alone would have been tens of millions annually. Over the contract's 10-year term, catastrophic, and Richard would have walked away rich, while thousands of employees, people like her mother, would eventually lose their jobs when the company collapsed under the financial strain. Clara looked at her mother asleep on the couch, exhausted from crying. She thought about staying quiet, about letting someone else handle it, about being invisible like her mother begged. But her grandfather's words wouldn't stop echoing. Truth doesn't need permission. It only needs a witness. Dawn broke gray and cold. The final contract signing was scheduled for 9 a.m., a formal ceremony with press photographers, champagne. Lan prepared to go in for her shift despite the suspension, hoping to plead her case to beg for her job back. Clara dressed carefully, tucking the evidence-filled notebook under her jacket. "Don't come with me," Lan said. "Please, baby, just stay home." "I can't, Mom." "Clara, he needs to see this. They all do." They rode the subway in silence, Lan's anxiety a palpable force between them. The building lobby was already filling with press and corporate representatives. Security recognized Lan, waved them through without question, just the cleaning woman and her daughter invisible as always. They took the service elevator to the 40th floor. The conference room gleamed with preparation, fresh flowers, polished silver crystal glasses arranged in perfect rows. Victor stood at the head of the table, rehearsing remarks with his communications director. The international delegates were seated, documents laid out, pens ready. This was the moment the triumphant signing the press release already written, the stock market announcement scheduled. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could turn around, walk away, let the adults handle their own disasters. But then she saw her mother's face, years of fear etched into every line, decades of silence carved into her posture. And she thought of all the other invisible people in this building, in every building whose lives depended on contracts they'd never read, decisions they'd never influence. She stepped forward. Victor raised his pen, poised above the signature line. "Sir," Clara said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "This is the wrong clause." The room froze. Every head turned. Victor's jaw clenched. "You again?" "Yes, sir. But this time it's proof." She walked to the table, opened her grandfather's notebook, and laid out the printed evidence. The bank transfer receipt on top, highlighted in red. User Richard Carter modified the contract 3 days ago at 11:23 p.m. She said, her voice steady, now clear. "The same night he received $1.2 million from Meridian Holdings, a shell company owned by your competitor's subsidiary." She pointed to the transaction details. "This wasn't an error. It was corporate espionage. He was paid to sabotage this deal." The room erupted into chaos. The French delegate stood examining the documents. "Mon Dieu, this is criminal." Victor's face had gone white. He took the papers, scanning them rapidly, his expression darkening with each line. Richard Carter, who'd been standing near the back, suddenly bolted toward the door. "Security!" Victor's voice thundered. "Stop him!" 2 guards blocked Richard's exit. He struggled, shouting, "You can't prove anything. She's just a child. She doesn't understand what she's reading." Clara turned to him, her voice quiet but absolute. "I understand perfectly. You sold your company for $1.2 million, and you almost succeeded." As Richard was dragged from the room, still screaming denials, Victor stood over the evidence spread across his glass table. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes beyond power and authority. She saw shame. The shame of a man who'd built an empire but forgotten to guard its soul. And she saw fear. The fear of realizing that his entire company had nearly collapsed because he'd stopped listening to the truth. Because he'd forgotten that integrity doesn't announce itself, it whispers, and only those who choose to listen can hear it. The scandal was contained within hours: lawyers' non-disclosure agreements, emergency board meetings behind closed doors. But Clara was summoned to Victor's office, a space she'd only glimpsed from hallways while her mother cleaned. The room was entirely glass, suspended 40 floors above the city, offering an unobstructed view of an empire built on contracts and calculated risks. Victor stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Sit," he said without turning. Clara sat in a leather chair that seemed designed to swallow her whole. When he finally faced her, his expression was unreadable. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "What do you want?" "Nothing. I just read carefully." He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Nobody reads carefully out of virtue anymore, kid. Everyone wants something." "My grandfather did," she replied. Victor's laugh died. He moved to his desk, studying her with new intensity. "Tell me about him." Clara hesitated, then began. She told him about the accountant who'd been fired for refusing to falsify quarterly reports for his executive. About the man who chose poverty over dishonesty, who died with nothing but his integrity intact. He used to say, "Truth doesn't need justification. It only needs people willing to see it." Victor sat down heavily, the leather creaking beneath him. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the city below. "Do you know what you've done?" he finally asked. "The board is calling for a complete internal audit. 3 executives have already resigned. Our stock dropped 4% today." "I know," Clara said quietly. "But it would have dropped 40% when the fraud came to light in 2 years. Victor stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. "You're 14 years old. You should be worried about homework and friends, not corporate fraud and financial projections." "I worry about my mother," Clara said. "I worry about people like her who work in buildings like this and never get to know what decisions are being made above their heads, decisions that control their entire lives." She leaned forward slightly. "You asked what I want. I want people to understand that numbers aren't just abstractions. They're people's jobs, people's homes, people's futures. Victor stood abruptly, pacing to the window. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. A man who'd spent decades mastering the language of power, only to be schooled by a child in the dialect of truth. "You know you've made me look like a fool in front of the board," he said, his voice lower now. "They're questioning my judgment, my leadership, my ability to protect this company." "I think," Clara said carefully, "if they don't want the truth, they don't deserve to lead." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Victor turned sharply, ready to respond with anger, but stopped. Because he saw something in her face that he'd forgotten existed, the absolute certainty of someone who'd never learned to compromise their principles for convenience. His daughter was 32, working at a hedge fund in London. She called twice a year. His son was 28, managing a tech startup in San Francisco. They spoke about markets and opportunities, never about meaning. When had he last had a conversation about what was right instead of what was profitable? He exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Your grandfather," he said. "What happened to him after he lost his job? He drove a taxi for 15 years. Then he died of a heart attack on his 63rd birthday. Did he regret it, losing everything?" Clara shook her head. "He told me once that he never lost anything. He said the only thing worth keeping in this life is the ability to look yourself in the mirror." Victor turned back to the window, his reflection wavering in the glass. "I haven't really looked at myself in years," he murmured. Another silence, deeper now, more honest. He pressed the intercom. "Send in Lan Nguyen." Clara's eyes widened. "Sir, my mother didn't—" "I know." Lan entered minutes later, her cleaning uniform replaced by her one good dress, her face lined with worry. She started to speak, but Victor raised his hand. "Mrs. Nguyen, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice formal but sincere. "Your daughter did nothing wrong. She did everything right. And I punished you both for it." He walked to his desk, wrote something on official letterhead, and handed it to Lan. "Full back pay for the suspension, a bonus equivalent to 6 months' salary, and a letter of commendation for your permanent file." Lan stared at the paper, tears forming in her eyes. "Sir, I don't—" "You raised a daughter who understands something I'd forgotten," Victor continued. "That integrity isn't a luxury. It's a foundation. Without it, everything else collapses." He looked at Clara again. "You said people like your mother work in buildings like this without knowing what decisions are made above them. That changes now. Starting next month, we're implementing an ethics transparency program where any employee at any level can flag concerns directly to the board." Clara's breath caught. "Sir." "It'll be called the Nguyen Protocol," he said. "After your grandfather. The man who taught you that truth doesn't need permission." As mother and daughter stood to leave, Victor remained at his window, watching their reflections disappear into the hallway. For the first time in 20 years, he whispered something he'd forgotten how to say: "I'm sorry." The words fell into the empty office, small and insufficient. But they were a beginning. And sometimes that's all integrity needs to rebuild what power has destroyed. It started with a single video. An employee had recorded the moment Clara confronted Victor in the conference room, shaky footage from a phone hidden behind a briefcase capturing the 14-year-old girl standing before the CEO with evidence of corporate fraud. The video was uploaded to social media at 11:47 p.m., with a simple caption: "The Maid's daughter who saved $750." By morning, it had 8 million views. By noon, every major news outlet was running the story. Lan woke to her phone exploding with notifications, messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, friend requests from strangers, reporters asking for interviews. She sat on the edge of her bed, trembling. "Clara, we need to leave. We need to hide. They'll fire me. They'll—" "Mom," Clara said quietly, taking her mother's hands. "The truth isn't wrong. We didn't do anything wrong." But the media had already surrounded the building. News vans lined the street, cameras pointed at every entrance, reporters shouting questions at anyone in a Weston Dynamics uniform. Inside, the executive team convened an emergency session. The communications director paced frantically. "This is a PR nightmare. A cleaning woman's daughter exposing internal fraud. The narrative is that we're incompetent, that our systems failed, that—" That we almost committed a $750 million mistake. Victor interrupted, and a 14-year-old caught it when our entire legal department didn't. Exactly. It makes us look human, Victor said. It makes us look human. The room fell silent. His chief operating officer leaned forward. Victor, the board is demanding damage control. They want a statement distancing the company from the girl, framing this as an isolated incident. No. Victor, I said no. He stood, buttoning his jacket. Schedule a press conference, immediately. 1 hour later, Victor stood before a wall of cameras and microphones. The room was packed, financial journalists, tech reporters, human interest writers, all watching with predatory anticipation. Victor adjusted the microphone, looked directly into the cameras, and began. 3 days ago, our company was about to make the worst mistake in its 40-year history. We were about to sign a fraudulent contract that would have cost us hundreds of millions of dollars and potentially destroyed this company. The room erupted with shouted questions. Victor raised his hand for silence. We were saved by Clara Nguyen, the 14-year-old daughter of one of our cleaning staff members. She noticed a discrepancy that our entire executive team, our legal department, and our international partners had missed. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. She had nothing to gain by speaking up. In fact, she risked everything: her mother's job, their livelihood, their security. But she spoke anyway because she understood something many of us had forgotten. His voice grew stronger, more deliberate. That numbers aren't abstractions. They're people's lives, people's futures. And when they're wrong, someone has to have the courage to say so, regardless of the cost. A reporter shouted, "Is it true she found evidence of internal fraud?" Yes. A senior executive had been paid by a competitor to sabotage our contract. He's now facing criminal charges. The room exploded with more questions, but Victor pressed on. Today I want to publicly apologize to Clara Nguyen and her mother Lan Nguyen. We suspended Lan for her daughter's integrity. We punished them for doing what we should have celebrated. He looked directly into the main camera, his expression raw with something rarely seen in corporate America: genuine remorse. Clara Lan, I'm sorry. This company is better because of you. I'm better because of you. The cameras flashed like lightning. Later that afternoon, Clara was brought into a smaller press room for a brief Q&A. She sat behind a table far too large for her microphones, crowding the surface lights, burning hot and bright. A journalist from the Financial Times asked, "Clara, why did you do it? What made you speak up?" Clara looked down at her hands, then back up at the cameras. "Because numbers talk," she said simply. "I just listened." The phrase became a headline within minutes. By evening, it was trending globally. Numbers talk artists created illustrations of Clara standing before Victor. Musicians wrote songs. Students started campaigns demanding ethical business education. The story transcended corporate scandal. It became something larger. Something that touched everyone who'd ever felt powerless, who'd ever wondered if speaking truth to power could actually change anything. That night, Victor held an emergency board meeting. "We're creating the Listening Fund," he announced. "A scholarship program for children of service workers, custodians, security guards, food service employees. We'll invest $10 million annually." The board members exchanged glances, calculating the public relations value. Victor saw their expressions and smiled coldly. "This isn't PR," he said. "This is payment on a debt we didn't know we owed." As the meeting ended, Victor returned to his office alone. The city glittered below him, thousands of buildings, millions of people, all connected by invisible threads of commerce and trust. He picked up his phone and found Clara's mother's number. Typed a message. "Tell Clara she taught me a new language. I'm still learning how to speak it, but I'm trying." He hit send before he could reconsider. Then he stood at the window and watched the city breathe. Somewhere down there in a small apartment, a girl was probably doing homework. A girl who'd reminded him that power without integrity is just noise. And truth, no matter how quietly spoken, will always be louder. 1 year later, Weston Dynamics had transformed. The company became the first Fortune 500 corporation to implement the ethical auditing program, a system designed from Clara's initial suggestion that any employee, regardless of position, could flag discrepancies directly to independent reviewers. The program was revolutionary. Within 6 months, it had identified 47 procedural violations, 12 accounting irregularities, and prevented 3 potential lawsuits. But more importantly, it changed the culture. People no longer whispered concerns in hallways. They spoke them in conference rooms. Clara received a full scholarship to the International Institute of Economic Languages, a prestigious academy in Geneva, where she would study financial ethics and global business communication. Lan was promoted to Director of Employee Development Services, the first time in company history that the cleaning department was mentioned by name in the annual report. Her new office had a window. She cried the first time she saw sunrise from the 15th floor. In October, Victor was invited to speak at the United Nations Global Compact Summit in Geneva. He brought Clara with him. The auditorium held 2,000 delegates from 193 countries, CEOs, ministers, economists, all gathered to discuss corporate responsibility in the modern age. When Victor took the stage, the room settled into expectant silence. A year ago, he began, "My company was on the edge of collapse. Not from market forces or economic downturns, but from something far more dangerous, ethical blindness." He gestured to Clara, seated in the front row. "We were saved by someone we'd trained ourselves not to see. A child whose mother cleaned our floors. Someone we considered invisible." His voice strengthened. "She taught me that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to listen when the truth comes from unexpected places." The audience applauded politely, but Victor raised his hand. "Today Clara will speak to you herself, because the person who lived the lesson should tell it." Clara stood, walked to the podium, and looked out at the sea of faces. Powerful people who shaped global economies, made decisions affecting billions. She was 15 now, taller, but still carrying her grandfather's notebook. "A single wrong number can destroy an economy." She began, her voice clear and steady. "But a single right action can save the world." She opened the notebook, showing the worn pages to the camera, projecting her image on massive screens. "My grandfather wrote that honesty is the most fluent language. I'd add that courage is how it's spoken." She closed the book gently. "In every building, in every company, in every government, there are people who see the truth, but don't speak it. Not because they don't care, but because they've been taught that their voice doesn't matter." She looked directly at the audience. "I'm here to tell you it matters. Every voice matters. Every truth matters. Especially the ones that come from places you're not used to looking." The auditorium was completely silent. "Don't wait for someone like me to catch your mistakes. Build systems where truth can travel freely, where integrity isn't a luxury, but a requirement, where listening isn't a weakness, but your greatest strength." She paused, letting the words settle. "Because the next crisis you face won't be solved by the loudest voice in the room. It'll be solved by the truest one." She stepped back from the podium. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then one person stood. Then another. Then another. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applause thundering through the space like a force of nature. In the audience, Lan covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with tears. Beside her, Victor stood, clapping, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, gratitude perhaps, or redemption. On stage, Clara looked out at 2,000 standing people and thought of her grandfather. The man who died poor. The man who died honest. The man who taught her that truth doesn't need a title. It only needs a witness willing to speak. And now the whole world was listening. Early morning light filtered through the windows of their new apartment, modest but warm, overlooking the city that had once seemed so distant. Lan prepared tea, the steam rising in gentle spirals. Clara sat at the small wooden table, her grandfather's notebook open before her. The pages had yellowed further, the ink fading slowly into memory. She traced her finger over his words. "Honesty is the most fluent language." Beneath it, in her own handwriting, she'd added, "And courage is how it's spoken." Her phone chimed an email from the United Nations requesting her to speak at their Youth Leadership Summit on ethical governance. Clara looked up at her mother. "Grandpa, they're listening now." Lan smiled through fresh tears, setting down 2 cups of tea. Outside, the city awakened millions of lives, intersecting each one, carrying its own truth, its own story. Clara walked to the window, watching the sun paint gold across the Weston Dynamics building in the distance, the place where everything had changed. Where a decimal point became a revolution. where a whisper became a roar. She thought about all the people in all the buildings, the invisible ones who kept the world running, cleaners, guards, drivers, servers, all carrying truths. No one asked them to speak. "Mom," she said softly, "what if everyone started listening?" Lan joined her at the window, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Then maybe," Lan whispered, "the world would finally hear what it's been missing." Clara nodded, holding her grandfather's notebook against her chest. One small dot on a page. One small person in a vast world. But sometimes the smallest things rewrite the story of justice. If this story made you believe that truth always has a voice, share the moment you dared to speak what was right in the comments below. Subscribe to Maid's Daughter Stories, because your voice matters, and the world is listening.